Hello everyone, welcome to Full Moon Movies. The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus is not a film you watch. In fact, it is a film you enter. Terry Gilliam builds a world that feels sketched by hand, stitched together by theatre cloth, fairy tale madness, and spiritual wages that are older than time itself. At its beating heart is Dr. Parnassus, played with a gentle melancholy by Christopher Plummer, a man who once wagered immortality for wisdom, then wagered again for love, only to later bargain away his own daughter's future to the ever-grinning trickster Mr. Nick, played by Tom Waits, at his most delicious coy, playing the devil not as a tyrant but as a negotiator who always arrives with paperwork and charm. Parnassus is not hero, not villain. He is in fact a tragedy incarnate, prove that human heart often trades everything for what it believes it cannot survive without. His daughter Valentina, radiant and rebellious, stands at the crossroads of fable and free will, longing not for transcendence but for choice, the one thing immortals forget to give their creations. Then comes Tony, the wild card, the liar the narrative didn't see coming, played first by Heath Ledger, then lovingly reshaped mid-film into Johnny Depp, Jude Law and Colin Farrell. Now this transformation is not cosmetic, it is to the point. Tony is a man impossible to stabilize, a mirror-shifting shape whenever mortality demands a definition. Ledger gives him a slippery magnetism, a man both sincere and deceitful in the same breath. And when the other actors assume the role inside the Imaginarium dream logic, it feels like the film confessing that identity is the greatest illusion of all. Opposite Tony is Anton, played with grounded loyalty by Andrew Garfield, whose quiet devotion becomes a human anchor in Gilliam's carnival of metaphysics. Where Tony shifts, Anton persists. Where Tony tempts fate, Anton tries to save those fate which has already marked. And fate in this story is not concept, it is a carousel attraction. The Imaginarium itself is a traveling theatre wagon that opens into landscapes of the psyche. Step inside and you are not judged, in fact you are revealed. Gilliam uses these inner dimensions to argue that imagination is not an escape, but unfettered truth. The production design on Bluray still dazzles, tactile and textured. All tangible gears and theatrical paint strokes are deliberate rejection of the sterile digital gloss. Now, this is a world that looks built, not rendered cloth tents, curtain truths, staircases to nowhere, and oceans of self-deception. Because Gilliam doesn't want you to gawk at the illusion. In fact, he wants you to feel the splinters holding it all together. The Blu-ray transfer preserves that intent beautifully, capturing the warm saturations and handmade grimness of the sets without over-cleaning the frame. The colors lean storybook rich, shadows careless rather than overwhelmed, and the grain remains alive, giving the film the texture of a dark fable told beside flickering lanterns. Yet beauty here always carries a price. This film is preoccupied with the economics of souls, how we trade them, rationalize the trade, rename that trade, and forget the trade, then demands refunds from destiny when consequences actually arrive. Nick never lies. Now that's the genius of his villainy. He offers terms humanity signs them. He is not temptation, in fact he is the fine print. The satire underlying the spectacle is really sharp but not cynical. Gilliam is not mocking faith, mythology or storytelling. In fact, he's mourning a world that keeps bargaining away wonder for convenience. Now the Imaginarium shows people what they want, and that is exactly why it defeats them. The desire is the easiest trap because it feels like freedom. The film was shaped by grief as much as imagination. Ledger's death at mid-production forced the narrative to pivot, that somehow which elevated the film rather than fracturing it. Most films would hide such a rupture, but Gilliam turns it into mythology. Tony is no longer one man. In fact, he is the idea that men are shape-shifting contradictions, costumes worn over unresolved hunger. It is one of the cinema's rare moments when tragedy did not interrupt art. In fact, it rewrote art into something more enduring. Critically, the film was divided with the audience. Many were seduced by its visual delirium, its carnival philosophy, its tarot deck cosmology, but others felt lost in its structure, arguing its favored whimsy over emotional clarity, that it was more like a pageant than a story. Commercially, it never reached mass appeal, earning modest box office returns, but its afterlife has been really rich, the kind of film revisited, decoded, cherished by those who don't need answers handed to them. Its flaws, its excess, its narrative zigzags, its emotional opaqueness are inseparable from its identity. This is a film that wears its unruliness like a crown. The emotional climax does not thunder, in fact, it concedes. Parnassus does not defeat his evil, he outsmarts his anger by letting go of the very thing he tried to own, which is his daughter's life. Freedom comes not from the victory, but release. The Imaginarium closes not because imagination failed, but because love finally chose to surrender over barter. And in that surrender, the film reveals its gentlest trick. Imagination is not about worlds we build, but what unwinds in us when the fantasy no longer needs defending. The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus remains one of the strangest, saddest, and most beautiful cinematic love letters to storytelling itself. It whispers that the world is not made of rules, but agreements, and agreements can be rewritten if you are willing to burn the contract. It asks us not what we would wish for in another world, but what parts of ourselves we would finally stop negotiating away. When the curtains close, you don't really have to leave the imagining magic. In fact, you leave the interrogating the bargains you already made. And that ultimately is Gilliam's greatest conjuring trick. Now, this movie is a must watch.